we have just concluded our reading of the book Middlesex, which means that we've been immersed in this long story for 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, however long you got into it. And we opened up lots and lots of questions of identity, particularly having to do with gender and sexuality, but many other aspects too through that. Now we're going to pull the camera way back out again and talk about stories in general. That's what our speaker here is to talk to us about today. We began with a talk about stories from Dr. Wantley, and we're going to end with a talk about stories from Kendall Haven today. Kendall Haven is an award-winning writer, speaker, and consultant. He's a world traveler. He's highly sought after as an expert on stories and what they do for us and how our minds are geared to work with stories. He graduated from West Point, and then he studied oceanography. Where did you study, Ken?
Oregon State.
Oregon State, and worked for the Department of Energy for several years before changing his life and becoming a storyteller and somebody who talks about the telling of stories. He is, in fact, a master storyteller and has been a leader of organizations and, as I said, a world traveler telling stories, and somebody who preaches the gospel of storytelling. Now he devotes much of his time, this is what he's going to talk about today, again, as I said, to really helping us understand the role of stories in our lives and how they help us develop identity. This is Kendall Haven. Please welcome him. Thank you. Struggle with our mic.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're having a little mic issue. It may not be worth, if the mic isn't right in my mouth, you're not hearing anything from it. So I'll do this a little bit. When I get tired of holding it, we'll just go without. Good afternoon. What I want to show you today, you've been reading a story, right? And what I want to show you today really is that who you are is your story version of you. But I want to show you what that means. What we've been doing in the last few years is doing a lot of research on what happens between your sensory organs, eyes or ears, when you experience something, when you hear something, when you read something. What happens between those sensory organs and your conscious mind? And it's a lot. What reaches your conscious mind is not at all what got to your sensory organs. Which is why you can have a debate about a book and different people have different opinions on it. You read the same book, but what got to your conscious mind is not at all the same as what got to someone else's conscious mind. But we actually know a lot about what that pathway looks like and what happens along it. So I want to introduce some of that to you today. So what we're really looking at is your brain on story, or when you want to get some point across to someone, what you're really worried about isn't so much your brain and your story, unless you're worried about identity. What you're really playing with is everyone else's brain and what happens to them. So that's what I want to talk about. And let me start with kind of an odd question. You guys have been reading a story, right? And you tell stories, you hear stories. Where does the story happen? Grammatically, that sounds like an odd question, but where does the story happen?
Brain.
Whose brain?
Everybody.
Pardon?
Everybody.
You don't care about everybody, though.
Okay.
You care about your brain. Now, I'm not saying you don't care about everyone, but for this question, you really don't. The point is, if you're creating the story, if you're telling the story, what happens in your brain, what happens in your pen when you write, what happens in your mouth when you speak, isn't really what you're after. What you're after is the answer to that question, which is in the mind of the receiver. Which is an odd thing, because you don't have direct access to the mind of the receiver. You really don't. So when I'm saying that, what I'm talking about is making sense, the process. When you read something, you hear something, here's what the research says. Either you can make sense out of it, or you give yourself permission to ignore it. And most of the time, you're always looking for a reason to ignore stuff that's coming in at you. If you can make sense out of it, you pay attention to it. If you can understand it, you pay attention to it. And then it has a chance to get to your conscious mind, into memory banks, in a way so you can pull it back out and recall it. So when someone's trying to get to you, and you do something like write a big book, there's a thought they're trying to get to you. But instead of just giving you the thought, what they have to do is write this whole big book and spend literally months, if not years, on just the writing of the book, because what they're worried about is how you're going to make sense out of it and understand it, and whether or not you'll even pay attention to it in the first place. No, I was going to give you a little bit on my background. I'll say only this, because I don't want to take up very much time with it. Yeah, I was doing science research. I was leading a research team down at UC Berkeley. We're actually up on campus at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. We were looking at the oceanic, the environmental implications of advanced oceanic energy technologies for the Department of Energy, and I started to take care of a 4-year-old part-time who was the son of my fiance at the time, her sister, who was a single mom. So I'd take the kid and we'd go to the park and play, and the only way I could get him to slow down, when I had to get him to slow down, which I was supposed to be doing when I took him to the park, was to flop in the sandbox and make up stories. I didn't care. I was doing it for child management. I was doing it to keep me out of from getting in trouble with his mom. But every time I'd start a story, other kids would just materialize. You wouldn't even see them in the park, and then suddenly, bam, they're there. And pretty soon, whatever adult brought those kids to the park, this is back in the early 80s before cell phones, so when you were talking to the park, people didn't automatically assume you were on a cell phone conversation. Whoever brought those kids to the park would wander over to see why their child was hunkered down in the sandbox with a strange man in the middle of the day who wasn't at work when he should have been. And they'd come over and they'd say, "Oh, I don't have to call the cops, he's just telling stories." And more often than not, they'd stay. And I would look up from these little stories that I was just flat making up to keep one 4-year-old quiet for a while. And there would often be rings of 100 people standing there and listening. There was no guarantee the story was going anywhere. And anyway, they came in the middle, so they didn't know if it would go anywhere or not. It didn't matter. As soon as you could see them walking by, and they'd slow down, and they'd kind of lean in, like a gravity well was happening. They were just being sucked into the story. Now I've been able to show it in the EEG labs when I do research on stories. As soon as you think that you're listening to something that's a story, your brain treats it differently. You can see different parts of your brain light up. You devote more brain space and energy when you're listening to a story than to any other kind of input. It can be the same information, but you listen much more deeply when you think it's coming in story form. You pay more attention to it. And we can see it in the EEG lab. We can watch brain sections light up all of a sudden as soon as it turns into a story that don't light up any other way. So, I'm there in the park, and one day it occurred to me, it's one of those little epiphanies, that if I sat in that sandbox and read any of the reports that I thought I was paid pretty good money by the Department of Energy to create, none of those people would stand around and listen. They were there because it was a story. These things that we talk about and call stories are incredibly powerful. When I do courses for writers and for people who want to be storytellers, the word I use is frighteningly powerful. They are. Stories have started wars, ended wars, changed lives, changed countries. These things are amazingly powerful, but we mostly don't think about it. I want to show you a little bit about how they work. Just a quick kind of an attitude to take when you think about stories. Think back over your life as a student, right? Going back to kindergarten, first grade. How many times have you sat in a classroom and had a teacher say, "Class, pay attention. Class, pay attention." Right? Sit in the back of any class, in any grade, any school, and you'll be able to count up hundreds of times. "Class, pay attention." Well, you know what that teacher is asking you to do? Think of it as an actual economic event. They want you to pay with something that's precious, your attention. And it would be a very legitimate question for any student to say, "Well, maybe I will and maybe I won't pay attention." What are you offering? But students never think of that, right? They should. Every time when we think of stories, what we're thinking about is how to engage someone in an economic event. You want to get an idea across to them. The research shows most people don't want to get your ideas. They won't pay with their attention to be influenced, to be changed. But they will pay to be engaged readily. If what you say is engaging to them, they're there. And then they will pay you with your attention, and while they're paying attention, you get to influence them. Hence, this guy who spent a whole lot of time on the writing in this book. The story, the writing is exquisite. And I will guarantee that that's years worth of effort just to polish the writing, just so you would be engaged and pay attention to the content. Because that's the way it works. You being the person who's trying to communicate, you got to give them engaging material, because what you really want to do is sell or give away your influence, but they only pay to be engaged. Right? You get that? So that engagement, and we were able to show this in the lab, information does not fully engage you. It never has, it never will. You're a human being. What engages you fully is something that involves you personally, that has an emotional component. Science have been for centuries giving out information, and nobody listens, right? Do you know how many studies have been done on climate change in the last 25 years? Credible science studies, over 2,800, that all conclude that, one, global warming is real, that is, say, climate change. Two, that human contributions to it are a real and important component of the forces driving climate change. And do you know how much those 2,800 studies over 25 years have changed public attitudes in this country on climate change, or whether it's real or not? 2 percentage points, from 39%, or 37% up to 39% that think it, or I'm sorry, the other way around. 39% down to 37% who think it's phony and think it's not a real thing. That's the effect of information. Because they never engage at an emotional level. That's what stories do. So, if that's what engagement is, and attention is dedicated mental focus over time, the role of a story is to engage. That's what they do in your brain. Then you can try to influence, which is change attitudes, beliefs, values. In order to do that, you got to get attention, so you have to engage, so you need to evoke that emotional component, and that's what stories do. That's why you put that kind of thing in a story instead of into an article or a lecture, if you want people to be able to be willing to spend months considering it. That's the role of story. Okay. Now, a little bit more on the science of story. Question for you. How long on this planet, in mass, have human beings been reading? You ever think about that? In mass. Let's make it more specific. I'll take North America and Western Europe, the early developed part of the world. In mass, how long have human beings in those parts of the world been reading? Any guesses? Thousand years. Do I hear 1,000 years? Do I hear 1,100 years? 1,000 going once. Do I hear 1,100? Do I hear 1,200? 1,200. Any calls for 1,200? Do I hear another number right here?
I said 10,000.
10,000 years. Ready for this? Reading about 200 years. At the time of the revolution, in this country, far less than half the country was literate. It's an incredibly new activity, which is why you had to be taught to read. There is no brain center for reading. Maybe in 20,000 years, there might be. You had to learn, you had to be taught to read because you don't have any brain subregions that are dedicated to that process. What about writing? How old is writing on this planet? I know it depends some on when you think pictographs turned into a formal written language, right? But researchers have actually done all these studies and they have an answer. Any guesses on writing? 500 years. That goes back to Gutenberg's Bible. By the way, you know, when Gutenberg printed his Bible, if he had printed about 500 copies, he would have covered most of the people in Europe at the time who could read. Reading was a very specialized activity back then. Older than that. Answer's about 7,000 years. Sumerian is usually considered the first formal written language. Although there is some research that says there may be able to bump that back to 8,500 years with some work in China, but they haven't found enough pottery shards to be able to construct an actual language out of it. Here's the kicker. How long on this planet had human beings been telling stories? 17 million years. I'm sorry, the price was not right. Any other guesses? Although 17 million is it actually predates human beings a little bit, but you know, researchers, when they look at something like this, they have to set up all these criteria for how you determine that one, there's a formal language, two, there's a societal structure that would be compatible with the exchange of information in the form we'd call story, that there were communities, that there's brain structures that would handle that sort of complex language structure. And so the answer right now is, actually, I've just been able to get that up to 150,000 years. Some new research out of Africa. At least for 150,000 years, people have been telling stories. Before there was writing, before there was any reading, we've been telling stories. This was first proposed by some evolutionary biologists and since has been tested to death by developmental psychologists. If for 150,000 years we have depended on story as the vehicle for communicating essential values, beliefs, attitudes, histories, and also for archiving all that information, because there was no writing, it had to be archived in human memory, right? And we did that in story form. If for 100,000 years we've been, 150,000 years we've been relying on story for that, that reliance has evolutionarily rewired human brains so you were born hardwired. And I mean literally hardwired. I've been able to go into the lab, in EEG labs, and see this neural network. You're hardwired to make sense of the world in story terms. You can't do it any other way. That's not the way your brain is wired. That's why we resonate with stories. It's because story form matches what happens inside your brain, the way it is wired to make sense of the world. So, communicate, archive, all those things. We've been rewired to do it in story terms. And that also means that's how we make sense, that's how we understand in very specific story terms. Now let me go a little farther with that, because this is where it gets to be cool stuff. The last couple of years I've actually had some funding to go into 24-channel EEG lab with video cameras and IR cameras, and we're doing oxytocin and dopamine swabs and cardio monitors and every kind of monitoring that you can possibly think of, because we had a budget for it, and watch people's brains respond to narrative material and what makes them work. And especially what we're looking at is how do you make sense out of, remember, and understand incoming material. And thing is, you do it in story form with this thing called, that we're now calling a neural story net. It is a hardwired, very specific set of subregions in the lower back part of your brain, and then in the subconscious part of your brain, that lie between sensory organs and conscious mind. Okay? Let's say you see something. You see something, you read a story. Goes into your eyes, and then this electrical signal, right, goes down the optic nerve to a couple little centers in the lower back part of your brain, partly that translate electrical signals into what we call letters and words, right? So you're doing that physical translation, but it also then lights up these little areas that we would call this neural story net. And it does that before the information ever gets passed up to the conscious mind, your frontal lobes. And in that process, what that guy does is turn it into a story form. Turn the information into story form to make it make sense to you, which actually explains something that always bugged me. Now, I don't know why it always bugged me, but it always did. Picture this, an intersection. Big intersection. Two cars come roaring into the intersection at 90-degree angles to each other. They slam into each other in the middle of the intersection. One of them flips over and catches on fire. The other one veers off. smashes into a power pole, knocks the power pole over, electric lines come down, people are screaming, sirens roar, in come the ambulances, they pick up the bodies, they pick up the wounded, whisk them off to the morgue in the hospital, and then the police go around and start interviewing the witnesses to find out what happened. They find 8 witnesses, and they get 8 completely different stories. And I always thought that meant that it proves that 7 out of 8 people want to lie to the cops. Turns out that's not what it proves. They were all telling the truth. How can that be? Because when we say tell the truth, we mean tell honestly what got to your conscious mind. And before that information, what happened, what they saw, what they experienced, got to their conscious mind, in order to make sense out of it, each one of them turned it into a story. And that's what their conscious minds thought was the truth. None of them are actually what happened. They're all the individual story versions of what happened. It's how you make sense of the world. Okay. So that's what this neural story net does. That's its job. And combine that with something else we've been able to identify in the lab, and then developmental psychologists have gone out and tested this other thing more extensively than you'd ever want to know about. And that's what we're calling the make sense mandate. If you can't make sense out of it, you ignore it. The thing is, for some reason, the job of initially making sense out of incoming information has been given by the human brain to the neural story net. So how does it make sense out of stuff? In story terms. Now, this is where it gets, so if you look at the make sense mandate, the neural story net, that's what they do. But here's the fun part. That is a very partial list of what that neural story net will do to incoming information in order to make it make sense. Why did those 8 people all come up with different stories? Because they had to make sense out of it. And that neural story net is very willing to do any of those things to incoming information in order to make it make sense. In case you don't believe that, I'm going to demo this to you in just a moment. You get to watch your own brain take information and completely flip it around to make it make sense. You do it all the time. When you speak, when you write, people do it to you all the time. And if you look at some of these, I mean, they'll even completely reverse information you give them, or if it makes it make more sense to them. And there's lots of research to show we do that all the time. Change it, misinterpret it, ignore half of what you say, and only take half of it forward. That's what your brain does. One of the glories of story is that writing something in story form minimizes the distortions that neural story net is making in order to make material make sense. Okay, so it actually looks like a prism. You know what a prism is? You know this triangular prism, light comes in, it gets bent, it gets refracted, goes back out, but what goes out isn't quite the same as what came in, right? Neural story net does the exact same thing to incoming information before it gets to the conscious mind. So here's the summary of that neural story net and why it's important to you. 1, that neural story net lies in your brain, lies between the outside world and your conscious mind. Nothing gets in from the outside to your conscious mind without going through that neural story net. And in so doing, you change that material into story form. You distort it, you warp it, you flip it around. You do anything you have to do to make it make sense so that the story that they get in their conscious mind is not at all what you said. The thing is, if you understand and use effective story structure, you minimize the distortion that neural story net creates. That's why you got something important you want to say. People tend to want to say it in stories. It gets the information far more accurately and powerfully into the conscious mind of the receiver. So, I said that is the way it works. I want to show it to you. I'm going to show you a couple of lines. Okay? Simple. Person number 1 says, where's John? Person number 2 says, well, I didn't want to say anything, but I saw a green VW parked in front of Carol's. Again, person number 1 says, where's John? Person number 2 says, well, I didn't want to say anything, but I saw a green VW parked in front of Carol's. What I'd like you to do is turn to the person sitting next to you and explain the following. 1, what's going on here? 2nd, what is the relationship between person number 1 who speaks, person number 2 who speaks, someone named John who's spoken about, and someone named Carol who's spoken about? Go ahead if you would explain that. Here's the point. How many of you said, nope, cannot possibly answer any of those questions? You didn't give me enough information? I didn't. Everything you just said, your neural story net made up instantly on its own in order to make it make sense. Now, in so doing, you made a whole lot of assumptions about that material I gave you in order to make it make sense. Let me show you a couple, and I'll go back. 1, if you take person number 2 literally, you assume that they're either hard of hearing or completely lost their mind. They were asked about a person. Person number 2 is talking about a car. There's no connection between those, except you, in order to make it make sense, created one. Without giving it a second thought, you assume that John must have a green VW. Doesn't say that at all. You assumed, I bet, that person number 1 and person number 2 are in the same room together, or the same physical location. It doesn't say that. These could be 2 sequential lines on the NSA spying feeds. You know, they monitor every conversation in the world already anyway, put it out somewhere. One of these could be from Germany, and one could be from Taiwan. You don't know, but that doesn't make sense to you, so you ignored that possibility. Okay, let's go on. There's one more I'll show you here in a moment, but let me go on to another one. Person number 1 says, hi, John. Person number 2 says, I'm not here. You never saw me. I'm not here. And person 1 says, oh, that's okay. Carol's gone home. Now, you know exactly how to make sense out of that, don't you? You assume person number 2 is John, and that person number 1 is a friend of John's. And what person number 2, John, is really saying is, keep it quiet. There's certain people I'd rather not bump into today. And person number 1, understands the situation, says, oh, it's okay, Carol's gone home, knowing full well that John doesn't want to bump into Carol. Right? That's not at all what it says. If you take what you're given as factual information, literally, you would have to conclude that poor person number 2 has lost his marbles, or his or her marbles, and has no sense of physical reality anymore, because, in fact, person number 2 is here. And you, person number 1, not only have seen him, you're looking at him right now. But you didn't say that, did you? Because it didn't make sense to you. So you were willing to take the factual information you were given and completely reverse its meaning just to make it make more sense to you. You did it back here too. I bet every one of you who looked at this line, well, I didn't want to say anything, thought to yourself, yeah, right. Person number 2 couldn't wait to blurt this one out. Been hanging around hoping to have a chance to say what he saw or she saw, right? But because it made more sense to you, you took the factual information you were given and completely reversed its meaning. You do it all the time. When you speak or write, people do it to you all the time. Show you one more. 3 sentences. He went to the store. Fred died. Sharon went hungry and wept. Can't you feel yourself trying to connect those together in a story? You just like you can't stop your mind from doing it, right? you're saying, oh, poor Fred went to the store and then he died. Ah, he's probably an old guy. He's had a heart attack carrying those heavy bags back home. And Sharon, what's the deal with her? She went. Did she weep just because Fred died and all the groceries spilled in the gutter? Is she's hungry, or did she feel anything for Fred? Notice, for example, that instantly, I bet you assumed that Fred is the guy who went to the store. Do you notice you were just willing to violate the laws of English? The laws of English says that he, a pronoun, can only refer to a noun that precedes it. You don't care. The laws of English don't stand a chance against that make sense mandate. It is incredibly powerful stuff. All right? And so every time you communicate, every time you read something, you have to know your brain is doing all of these things to the source material. When you speak or when you write, you have to know that other people's brains are doing the exact same thing to your stuff. If you use effective story form, you minimize that distortion. So the question is, how do we do it? Well, we like to infer, we elaborate, we project, we assume. All those things your brain does all the time. Quick demo. John felt lonely. He rang the neighbor's doorbell. Okay. Can you make sense out of that? Of course you can. But in so doing, you just made about 6 story-based assumptions that you do in a heartbeat. For example, you assumed that those 2 sentences have to go together, right? You did. So you try to connect them. And so you start saying, well, John must doesn't like feeling lonely. Okay, you created a problem. And you assume that he wants company. That's a goal to solve the problem, right? And so you assume that he believes in company. That's motive. These are all story terms, things you create automatically in your mind in order to make something make sense to you. Want to know the truth? So you assume you want next one. This particular John, in this situation, I ran into in juvenile hall. I go there sometimes to tell stories, test audiences. They're a great test audience because they're kind of like a captive audience. So I often will test new stories on them and see how they react. And this John was in juvie because it was not the first time he had been caught doing this and eventually wound up in juvie. He was working with a psychologist to get over it. When he gets lonely, he gets mean. He's the kind of mean that you really love. You just are so into being mean when you get lonely that you want to share it with the rest of the world. And the guy that lives next door to him, his neighbor, is an really old guy who had just come home from the hospital having had hip replacement surgery and was still in bed. So John went over, rang his doorbell, made the guy get out of bed with his walker and hobbled to the front door to open it, by which time John hid in the bushes. Waited for him to get back in bed and went and rang the doorbell again. About the 3rd time, the cops came in and picked him up, and that's when, but you didn't think that, did you? That's the truth. But you didn't think that because you jumped instantly to the version that would make the most sense to you based on your experiences. That's why different people come to different conclusions, saying the same thing. That's how your brain is wired to work. So it actually is like a pair of blinders. There are all sorts of possibilities in how to interpret something, how to make sense out of it that you never even consider because your brain is in such a rush to make sense out of it that you leap to all these assumptions, that you completely restructure all the information that's coming into you. Well, again, the question is, how do we do it? And the answer is, of course, prior knowledge. Prior knowledge is everything all your experiences up to this moment. Everything you've learned, everything you know that's right, everything you know that's wrong. You don't care, you know it, it's yours, and you're proud of it. I want to show you just how powerful prior knowledge is. What it does is create context and relevance. Relevance is how things relate to you. Context is how stuff fits into what you already know. I want to show you 7 groups of letters. It turns out there are 20, I only know there are 20 letters in it because it says so right there. But I know it's 7 groups of letters. They're short, they're simple. I'm going to give you 10 seconds. I want you to memorize all 7 groups of letters in 10 seconds. And again, these are short. It's easy. It's not hard. But you get 10 seconds and go. Okay, got them all? Why not? Any problem with recognition? You recognize all the letters, right? Do you know why you didn't remember? You don't remember them well? It's because there was no context, no relevance. Those groups of letters weren't relevant to you, but all I have to do is change the spaces between the letters. Not the letters or their order, just the spaces between them to make them relevant to you. And I can come back 3 or 4 days from now and you remember. Same exact letters, same exact order. All I did was change the spaces so that these groups link into your banks of prior knowledge. You're always looking to bring your banks of prior knowledge to bear on information. Show you one more. 7 sentences. John walked on the roof, Bill picked up the eggs, Pete hit the axe, Jim flew a kite, Frank built a boat, Harvey flipped a switch, Ted wrote a play. Got them? Any problem on comprehension? Pretty simple declarative sentences, right? Why don't you remember them? No context, no relevance. All I have to do is change the names. And I could come back next year and you would remember them because it would link into your banks of prior knowledge. Same exact sentences, all I did was change the names. That's how powerful this prior knowledge is. What you do when information is coming into you is in less than a heartbeat, far less than a heartbeat, dredge up what you know, what you believe about the world, and apply that to make sense out of what comes into you from the outside. And that's what gets sent into your conscious mind. One demo on how this kind of works. Here's a paragraph. A thirsty ant went to the river, carried away by the rush of the stream, and was about to drown. Oh no! A dove sitting in a tree overhanging the water plucked the leaf fell into the stream close to the ant. The ant climbed onto it, the ant floated safely to the bank. Shortly after, a bird catcher came, laid a trap in the tree. The ant bit and stung him on the foot. In pain, the bird catcher threw down his trap. The noise made the dove fly away. Here's what happens when you read a paragraph like that. First, you dredge up banks of prior knowledge. Physics, a little bit of biology, a little ecology. And you say, well, yeah, ants do get thirsty. And yeah, they could walk over by the river. And oops, if he fell in, that's not good for an ant. He could be carried away because they're not good swimmers. Now they can float for a while, surface tension and all, but once they go underwater, oops, bad, they're not a fish. And they could drown. And you know, the dove flew to the tree and they do like to sit in trees, and they would pluck a leaf with its beak and gravity would make it fall down to the water, and you say, okay, makes sense to me. And instantly you kick in your neural story net and say things like, the dove plucked the leaf on purpose. That's not in what I gave you. But it makes it make sense. And so you say, well, the dove wanted to help out the ant. Give him a leaf to float on. And so the ant climbs onto it, gets to the stream, and gets to the bank. And at that moment, without thinking about it, you assume that the ant figured out that the dove was trying to help him and that he, the ant, now owes a favor back to the dove, which is an awful lot of cognitive ability to give to an ant and a lot more than most biologists will give to him, but you don't care, you're now in story mode. So you assume that the ant knows what he's got to do. And then the bird catcher came and laid a trap in the tree, and you assume the trap was for the dove, right? No, it's for parrots. But that doesn't make any sense to you because it doesn't have anything to do with this story. So you eliminate all other possibilities other than the bird catcher was after the dove, and you figured the ant figured out exactly how to get rid of the bird catcher, what the bird catcher was after. This is a very smart ant. This is a very smart ant we got here. But as soon as the ant bit and stung him on the foot, then you know one good turn has caused another. There's a balance back in the world. All is right with the world. And you say, yep, makes sense to me. It makes sense to you because you forced it to make sense in story mode. Okay, I skipped that one. So why don't all stories work? Why don't we all get stories? One, we tend to tell family stories. When you're telling a story to the family, you omit all the information that you know the family already knows. Right? Why tell them to them if they already know it? Trouble is, research shows as soon as you go outside the family, you tend to tell those stories exactly the same way, and your new audience is lost because they don't have all of those banks of prior knowledge that the family has that they need. So these new audiences have to create stuff on their own out of your stories because you tend to leave out all the information that your family would have as banks of prior knowledge and the new audiences don't. Second, this has also been well tested. Once you know something, you can't remember what it's like to not know it. You try. You think you do, but you don't. And so you never know if the words you use, the sentences you write, will communicate effectively to someone else. Because whatever you say, whatever you write, works just fine for you. Why? Because you already know it. So any words will dredge up the right images in your mind, and you can't tell if what you write on your own, you can't really tell if what you write communicates effectively to someone else. That's why writers tolerate editors. We hate editors, but we tolerate them because they're an outside perspective that's looking at what we wrote. A third one, Betty Crocker effect. You know the Food Channel? There's a show on there called American Test Kitchen. It's kind of like the science version of making recipes and testing them. And they once decided to have a contest for the best brownie recipes ever. And went to a bunch of professional chefs, mostly in New York City, and got their recipes and did all their analysis of them, you know, the density of it, and the moisture content, and whether all the sugars had done whatever sugars do when you bake them, and the density of the chocolate flavor, and like 50 different little ways that they could scientifically measure a brownie, and then they eat it. Say, oh, didn't taste good, I like that one. And got down to 2 finalists and decided to go out on the streets of New York City and let the public sample both to decide which one was going to be the winner. And I don't know why, but they decided to add a 3rd plate of brownies. Went to the grocery store and got Betty Crocker boxed brownie mix and made it according to the recipe. And so I had 3 plates out there. It's like they had that's one of those control group things like you have when you want to do an experiment. And people came by and sampled all 3, and over 75% of the people who sampled the 3 of them picked Betty Crocker. When they asked, was it more chocolatey? No. Was the texture better? No. Was the moisture content better? No. Betty Crocker didn't win on any technical terms. And then they said, well, why'd you pick that one? Because it reminded me of what I had as a kid. It matched what was sitting in their banks of prior knowledge. We hold very tenaciously to our banks of prior knowledge. We're proud of them. We fight for them. We don't want you to come in and change them. Another reason to use story. You're much more receptive to changing your basic beliefs, attitudes, and values when it comes to you in story form than you are if it comes to you in any other way. So says the research. How does this look when you really play that same concept? National Institute of Health study a couple of years ago. They went to parents. They took 2,000 pairs of parents who were on the fence about whether to immunize their kids. Cut them in half. Half of them, they didn't do anything. Just let them go. The other half, they fed them over 200 studies that had been done that showed that the immunizations, childhood immunizations, do not create autism. They do not tend to suppress the development of the immune system. 2 big fears of the parents expressed. Over 200 studies, every one of them, jury. This is New England Journal of Medicine kind of stuff. And then watch them. You know the outcome? The group that got the scientific information was over 45% less likely to immunize their children than the ones who got nothing. Science research was not only not helpful, it was counterproductive. So they went back to those people and said, why did you immunize your kids? We gave you the studies. And they said, thank you, almost to a T. They said, thank you very much. It's good that you did because they proved to us that the immunizations are dangerous. And the researchers said, no, they don't. Here they are. They don't prove prove that at all. And the people said, well, you must have given us different studies before, because the ones you gave us before prove that the immunizations are dangerous. In order to make it make sense to them, they had completely reversed the meaning of over 200 scientific studies in order to make it match what they already knew, their current belief systems. We do that. We do that all the time. That is a very dangerous statement, but it's true. We always interpret new information to support what we already believe. Even if we have to completely reverse the meaning of the new information, we do it all the time. That's what your neural story net and that Make Sense mandate do. Here's also what the research says. And the last call for today for why you read something in story form. The research has shown it's incredibly clear. When we put something in story form, it has a far better chance to influence, that is, change attitudes, beliefs, values, behavior of other human beings. These things we're talking about that we so casually say, oh yeah, story. They are amazingly powerful because they can affect human beings where nothing else can. So, a couple of thoughts to leave you with. One, when we talk about effective story structure, the elements of it, that's the benefit that you get from using story structure, which is kind of anytime you want to communicate with another human being, what you're really after. Second, we're hardwired specifically for story, because that is how we learn, and that's how our brains are wired. Third, this Make Sense mandate is there, it's real, you can't ignore it. Oh, you can't ignore it, but it won't ignore you. You can't get around it. You've got to account for it somehow and allow, in the way you develop your material, for how you're going to deal with it. Because there's that neural story net that actually acts as a prism and distorts information. Effective story form minimizes that distortion. And we now know, although I haven't talked about them in here, that would be the next part if we were going to go on farther. We know those specific informational elements that create that effective story structure that matches the informational demands of the neural story net. We know how we've been able to see it in the lab. We can go into the lab and do experiments and test them. And so the conclusion then is who you really are, tying it back to that thought of identity, who you are, is really your own self-created storied version of you. It's not you, it's the story you create about you, which is why your version of you is different from other people's version of you. They're creating their own story version of you. So that's what I wanted to show you this morning, or this afternoon, actually, just a quick run through of what's the science, what is the state of science right now in doing story research for all of you. Thank you very much for your attention, and good luck with the story.